Thank you, Carolina and Cecilia. I was so happy to have the opportunity to come to Warwick. It's my first time. I assume it's always sunny, just like today. Yeah. But I truly love the environment, so warm. Like, I was up in Lancaster for a few years, and I kind of miss these conversations. And so what I am going to do is talk for half an hour and leave half an hour for discussion. And so, as Carolina was anticipating, this book came out in Italian 3 years ago. Obviously, it made more sense back then to talk about the great resignations and people quitting. But to some extent, it's an interesting conversation to have also today. Many of the case studies of the book reflect the Italian situation, but also the US context, a bit of China. But for today, I tried to look at the situation in the UK as well. So we'll try and squeeze, hopefully not too many things in. This is the trajectory, let's say, of quits, voluntary quits in the US up until 2025. We had a big increase in 2022 and 23 with almost 50 million people resigning each year, an average of 5 million something per month. And then obviously this was a very problematic situation back then, so it was part of a huge conversation in the US. Rising interest rates did contribute to the decline in voluntary departures, but nevertheless there's still quite a high number of quits monthly, and we'll look more into it. This is Italy. Italy is a very fascinating, counterintuitive example to me, because obviously it's a 55 million people country with, let's say, with 5 million unemployed and 2 million quits per year. And this table stops in 2022, but you can imagine, but the rate of voluntary departure has remained stable. So we are looking at 500 people quitting per trimester and 2 million per year, 2022, 3, 4, 5. And this is the UK, which I thought was interesting. But, I mean, this is also a photograph that looks at quarters. So what's fascinating to me, and then maybe we can try and figure out together why, but what was fascinating to me is that in 2025, I mean, the peak is almost the same as the Italian, because every quarter it was about a little less than 500,000 people quitting. But then it went down to 200,000 per quarter. And so it's half as much as Italy's case. And I'm curious to try and figure out with you what the cause of it is. Possibly unemployment and economic frailty and economic insecurity have played a role in becoming a disincentive. But what's also interesting is looking at the rates by industry, because I was living in Switzerland up until last year. And Switzerland, we have an idea of Switzerland as a perfectly run country where, you know, no problems ever existed. But the sectors where people quit are very much the same in every country, and therefore this is US in 2021, but I thought it made sense to keep this slide, because even though for years have passed, accommodation, leisure and hospitality, retail, in so far as private businesses are concerned, are in almost every country without any exception key sectors for high rates of voluntary resignations. And then though we go into the public and private sector, I mean, depending on the country, but transportation, education, health services are also growing in terms of departures, numbers of departures. And I would also actually say that nowadays there's an emergency in these sectors across countries. So there's a curious continuity in terms of which sectors are problematic in terms of voluntary turnover. And we could also hypothesize that the fact that these sectors have been organized or organized in a very dysfunctional way is probably one of the root causes of why reason quit. It's also interesting to me, looking back at these slides, that one thing that surprised me as I was working on this is that, at least in Italy, if you look at the sectors where people quit and sectors that attract staff, manufacturing has been attracting workers, which was mind-blowing for me at the beginning, because manufacturing, when I was growing up, was the symbol of exploitation. And so working in a factory was like being exploited by definition. Whereas the struggles in the 60s and 70s in many countries have had an impact in terms of work safety that many other sectors don't have. For instance, creative industries and journalism, where work by the piece, I'm not sure this is the right expression in English, does exist, whereas it doesn't exist in manufacturing. So there's a tendency to move towards manufacturing to find a more protected job, which again was surprising. So the book tries to do three things. It goes into the history of our attachment to work, tries to reconstruct it. It goes into the field only in Italy to figure out case studies, and then it goes internationally, so China, the US, in different examples. But how do we get attached to work? So why is it that it's become normalized, and more so, why is it that people are surprised that people quit? So, because this is something that is curious to me, because to me, obviously, if you're not happy where you are, you should strike or quit, or strike and quit. But it's surprising that people quit for many. And so how did we get attached to work? And the very simple explanation, or at least the key example for me, was the Ford factory back in 1915. So when Ford changed the labor organization inside his plants, the assembly line, thank you, and introduced the assembly line, then the intensity of work increased very much. And by then, the turnover rate was 370%, so somewhere in there. 1913 turnover rate 370%. That means he had to hire around 50,000 people per year to have 12,000 people working in the assembly plant and give continuity to the process of production in such a way as to have a return on investment on machinery, because obviously it was very expensive back then to change the mode of production towards the assembly line. And Ford did a couple of things to solve the problem, reduce the working day, double wages, and which is a very surprising sign of very enlightened choice, because in a couple of years, turnover decreased to 16%. So that is a case in history where we can begin to figure out what's the problem with high turnover. We don't really have data that help us reconstruct the history of turnover. Data is scattered. And what we can say, though, is that in times of crisis, turnover rates increase. But this decision by Ford, and so the decision to have direct, indirect salary, therefore to protect employment, create a system of welfare after in the following years, and pensions, that sort of social construction granted stable staff throughout the 40s years. So in a sense, our attachment to work begins then, but then if we look at the history and at the beginning of when turnover rates started increasing again, we have to go back to the 90s. And back in the 90s, what happened is that obviously we begin to see mass layoffs at plants, processes of restructuring, the idea of meritocracy, KPI, performance, all of these changes in work culture began to take place. And already in 1994, Hal Lancaster wrote in the Wall Street Journal that the social contract between employers and employees, in which companies promise to protect employment and secure the careers of their loyal troops, is dead, dead, and dead. So to me, even though this is 1994, but that is the beginning of what we see today. So when we talk about the Great Resignation, to me, we talk about the end of a very long historical process where the precarization of work, the intensification of the workday, the attempt to extract more and more unpaid work, really, from employees is the reason why this contract was broken. And interestingly enough, we talk about the Great Resignation 30 years later, but this is also why, in my personal view, this is not gonna end, but that is to be discussed. And so quitting, in my view, is not a solution, which is one of the main sort of controversial things of the book. Those who criticized it said it's not a solution, but indeed it isn't, I agree. It's a symptom of the dysfunction of the post-Fordist organization model, and I tried to lay out why. And increased workload, and then there's this tendency to cut staff numbers as much as possible. That was a strategy to be more competitive and save in labor costs, but it turned out to be very problematic. Cuts in staff, loss of control over shifts, as we will see, burnout, toxic work environment, value misalignment. This is a list of problems with work, but we can actually look at them more closely as we try and break down what happens in different sectors. And so very simply, what happens when people quit is that they weigh up the pros and cons of work, and the key factors in this sort of calculation are time, how many hours does that work require of my life, money, how much am I paid, health, recognition and values. So these are key factors in sort of balancing out or figuring out whether that work is worth my time, or is it worth it? And obviously, when people quit, that comes from a negative answer, and the process of reflection that might continue for several months. So I wanted to take you across the different sectors, because there's surely continuities with the UK. These are interviews that people working in different sectors gave to me. I chose one for sector. This is from the care sector, actually people working in public hospitals immediately after the pandemic. And I think there may be a very nice, actually not nice, but several similarities between the British and the Italian situation. And so the combination of health and burnout and workload turns out differently in each sector, but this employee says, I would arrive at the hospital, stand in front of my workplace and feel nauseous, almost vomiting, at the entrance. After COVID, the pressure dropped and I started to see things more clearly. We had to start running again without asking ourselves too many questions. And then he goes, this is a doctor, onto how he felt: cardiovascular problem, increased tobacco consumption, difficulties with ordinary social life because we had become robots. Many of us went through something close to a depressive symptom. The occupational health doctor confirmed it. A lot of people were dealing with problems of this kind, burnout related. We had never stopped, and the problem is that today we're working even harder. Nurses work around the clock, surgeries during the day, emergencies at night. But to care for people, you have to be well. You cannot make yourself ill in order to do your job, but they don't understand it because, as I'll say again, they don't care how you are, you just have to work. So if we look at the hospital, the care sector, this is a list of more specific problematics because each sector is organized in a different way. And so in the hospitality sector, there's a reason why people quit. They are not reflected, for instance, in public health care. But chronic understaffing in public health care is a key problem, and that also means unfilled vacancies, and unfilled vacancies in return makes voluntary turnover almost become chronic, because obviously if you're understaffed you have to work more and it becomes chronic. Hiring freezes, which I think characterizes the NHS as well as the public healthcare system in Italy, which is a very sadistic policy because you freeze the possibility of hiring people. In Italy, they hire freelance doctors and nurses, and they end up paying them even 5 times as much. But so it's a complete failure in organizing terms and even in economic terms. But then excessive administrative burden, poor communication, rota instability, bullying cultures, which is really quite important, lack of career progression, low pay, increasing workloads and burnout. And these key elements are very much related to each other, because even the bullying culture for understaffed, overworked, underpaid staff is oftentimes the only way of organizing labor. So bullying becomes a governing factor in the workplace, which is unbelievable. Actually, the most surprising sector for me was the retail sector, because I didn't know it at all. And Barbara Ehrenreich, a journalist actually from the United States, who wrote Nickel and Dimed and worked at Walmart for a while. And she pointed out that the retail stores, staff is organized through rituals of humiliation. And that's the same that I found in the retail workers in Italy. And this is just another testimony. I'm leaving a permanent job because I'm fed up with the insults, the grueling shift, the disrespectful customers, and the Sundays, 3 out of 4 each month, away from my family. I went home and cried out of fear, anger, and at how they treated me like shit until the very last moment, making me feel like there is an army of workers are out there ready to take your place. But I also cried out of a sense of liberation. I don't know what expects me, whether it will be better or worse. But what I do know is that if I had stayed, I would have become ill. So the mental health, the physical health factor is important. And again, retail sector, scheduling unpredictability. What's fascinating to me is that in many sectors, it would really only take nuances and for staff to feel better at work. For instance, if you are able to manage your time and organize your shifts, and you can do so 4 weeks in advance, let's say, then you can simply have a life. So if I'm able to schedule my shifts 4 weeks in advance, then I can plan. But that doesn't happen. And the reason why it doesn't happen, I think, is because there's a bit of sadism on side of management that thinks that human resources, by definition, you must be able to allocate them where you need, when you need them. And so this whole idea that individuals are human resources creates situations such as this, where people quit because they can't manage their time, and they can't manage their time even though they're overworked and underpaid. So many times, there's not just one problem, there's a combination of problems. But if all these instances happen at the same time, overworked, underpaid, can't manage my time, then obviously people quit. So people often tell me, why talk about those who can afford to quit their jobs? I'm like, it's not that they can't afford to quit their jobs, it's just they can't afford to work like that. And our imaginary of work has still not kept up with this level of exploitation and humiliation of the workforce, if the debate is still, again, surprised that people quit. Chronic overwork, rituals of humiliation, this is really something in the retail sector, because I've had the micromanaging and the harassment of women. It was truly unbelievable to me. Like, women asked in Italy to be inspected, body inspection, if they left, if they used the bathroom and left it not perfectly clean, to see who was guilty of that. So you have the whole management of the store searching, threatening to do a body inspection of all women. It's quite incredible, the amount of mobbing and harassment that goes into these low-paid jobs, and emotional labor demands, and And the last one I'm gonna, and then I'm gonna move a bit faster. I'm gonna mention is hospitality, because hospitality is also probably, in my mind, is the future of work, because it's often informal. It almost borders with servant culture, or people in the hospitality sector have many characteristics that remind me of servants, really. So we need to go back to the Gilded Ages and to the 19th century or even the 18th century, because women in hospitality many times also have to endure harassment. Many times it's sexual harassment, because their presence is assumed to be part of a recreational stay for customers and even for management. So the informality of the sector is really concerning, because when you're doing an informal job, there's really no rules whatsoever. So in this sense, I think it's the future of work, especially in Italy, because the informal sector is growing. And so when the pandemic struck, I had to stop and ask myself what I had actually earned over the years. A disintegrated social life, after 6 or 7 years as a seasonal worker, changing jobs and colleagues each time, you end up with no social life at all. I reached the point where I thought that if I had been a monk, my life might have been better. So I asked myself, is it worth it going on? Now, when all is said and done, no matter how hard things are, I would do anything not to go back to that world. And the nightmares of people working in hospitality are surprising. Like, people having nightmares every night because the rhythms are very intense, the amount of hours are very long. And then in leisure, for instance, drinking, drugs, and medication, so to speak, are quite common. And so the amount of emotional work that goes into this job makes it a very, very heavy job. So extreme rota instability and split shifts. So split shifts means many times you need more staff during rush hours, or like a more key, so during lunch and dinner. That means you might start very early in the morning and finish very late at night, but split shifts means you basically don't have a life. and informal work, wage theft, high physical and emotional demands, little recovery time, bullying and harassment normalized as kitchen culture, seasonal and precarious contracts, no sick pay culture, language barrier for migrant workers, especially working in the kitchen, combined with lack of training or support, management by intimidation rather than coordination. This is like the cultural environment of low-paid jobs. So since I've already spoken for more than 20 minutes, in main surveys, there are several surveys, again, but the key points of complaint are quite common: work-related stress, toxic work environment. I love the word toxic because it means everything and really nothing. So by the word toxic, you can point to such a huge number of factors but what it does mean is that the organization of work is poisonous. So, and that is quite a strong word to use. Poor pay, lack of work-life balance. This has a direct consequences in disengagement. I've spoken with I don't know how many businesses, interestingly, and ADs and human resources micromanagers maybe over the past 3 years. And one thing they don't really want to understand, because I think they do understand it, is that if people are disengaged, if people quit, the amount of money you lose is such that should you invest in more staff, higher pace, and shorter work days, might be a safer choice. So even from an economic point of view, disengagement has a cost, recruitment has a cost, training has a cost. But the idea that you must manage human resources the way it's more profitable has been poisoning in terms of management culture. And then effects on mental health are really problematic all over the world. These are different statistics, but depression, anxiety, and burnout are very common. I'm gonna not focus on China, but we can do it eventually later. I wanted to go to the end of the presentation because I think it's interesting where we are today. Because today, some people still, like in Italy, when the book came out, sorry, that's not where I wanted to take you. I wanted to take you here. Some people said, well, why even talk about resignations? Where do you see resignations? And I understand the fact that they're skeptical because our debate focuses on completely different things. We're all looking at the moment, we're all waiting for the moment where jobs will disappear. So we were not ready for workers to disappear. And however, if we look at what has happened very carefully after 2022, 2023, first of all, there's a backlash. There's been a backlash, and this is a happening over the most recent months in a few countries in the world. I'm looking specifically at Germany because, of course, it's a core European country. Particularly, it's a core European country that up until today has had very high subsidies, a very high use of part-time work, a very regularized use of part-time jobs, and because it is also a symbol of what happens after the automotive sector has declined, basically, has lost its ability to compete with China. And so in Germany, Merz is saying Germans have to work more again and again. He's explicitly considering banning part-time work. Actually, when I was working in the UK, also in Lancaster, part-time work was not seen positively towards the end as well. And I guess the idea is that if people work part-time, they cost you more, and it's better to have fewer employees that work as much as possible rather than have many that work little. And so there's a backlash in terms of work-life balance mentality, to quote Merz, because that's a problem to him. He's obsessed with it. If you follow the German chancellor, he's quite pleasure to, because he's very explicit about his hatred for part-time workers. But also Greece just allowed 13 hours by law work days, and of course Milei in Argentina has allowed passed a labor reform that also makes it possible to work for 12 hours in a row. So this is quickly happening. But I think what's interesting to me about this change is that one of the reasons why they want to increase the workday is that despite the fact that we keep talking about jobs disappearing because AI is taking over, workers are disappearing. So there's a labor shortage in many sectors throughout Europe. And so after the Great Quit, for people who haven't looked at the Great Quit, to me, it's harder to understand exactly where the labor market is going today, because it's very polarized. And in Italy, for instance, 1 business out of 2 can't recruit workers. And generally speaking, in Europe, they say we'll be missing 7 million workers by 2030. So we're talking about the fact that labor will disappear, but what's really, really happening already is that workers have disappeared, and no one's talking about it, or rather, they're talking about it so insofar as they consider it to be an effect of a demographic change. So if I base my understanding of this specific, if I look at labor shortage and look at, for instance, Italy and the US. In the US, for instance, one of the many causes for labor shortage is, for instance, that they don't have asilo nido, how do you say that? Child care. So many women have not been able to go back to the labor market because of labor shortage in childcare, and therefore women have nobody to leave their children to, and therefore have not been able to go back to the workforce after the pandemic. But in general, when we talk about labor shortage, we have several causes. For instance, change in migration patterns, which is very intuitive. Now everyone wants to close borders. Trump wants to close borders, but then at some point he has to soften his policy because no one's working in agriculture anymore. So I mean, it's really absurd. Demographic changes. So in Italy now, the conversation goes that demographic winter, which is an interesting expression because it's almost like a seasonal, a natural phenomenon, determines labor shortage. But 3 years ago, and only 3 years ago, the idea of the demographic shifts was not so central in the debate. Actually, newspapers were saying that there was a labor shortage because people were receiving UBI. So this sort of basic income that allowed each family to receive up to 550 euros per month. So really not, you couldn't become rich or stop working. But what I'm trying to say is that there is a labor shortage, but the cause is more obscure than I think the public debate has it. And another reason that is normally quoted is the mismatch between supply and demand. So in Italy, for instance, all skilled workers migrate because there's very little skilled jobs offered, but there's very many skilled workers or graduates that do migrate. So to me, they keep saying universities must train students to make them more skills because our labor market suffers a shortage of workers. But the reality is that Italian labor market is almost entirely service economy, hospitality, tourism, logistics. and it's not sectors that really demand a high skilled labor force. High skilled labor force migrates. And so what they're not looking at is that the conditions are so bad that people do not accept to work in certain sectors anymore, and that is the key. And if this convinces us, or at least this is an hypothesis to be tested, but what is interesting to me is that if you look at where workers are missing in Italy, for instance, it's the public sector. Also because the cost of living has increased so much that wages in the public sector have remained stable, and therefore healthcare sector, police, transports, and also education have a chronic now shortage of labor, and as well as again the hospitality and retail. So these sectors are missing workers, and this is the UK because again, same problems in the same sectors across countries. So police officers who have been resigning, and NHS. And even though I understood today that the current government is incentivizing exits from the NHS. And therefore, that might also explain the increase in voluntary resignation on top of what we've said so far. But just to get to the end of this presentation, it's an interesting, there's an interesting contradiction to me in the workplace today, because we have been expecting mass redundancies and artificial intelligence sort of to substitute workers. In Italy, there was an article the other day about a business in the northeast of the country that laid off 37 workers. And they did say it was because of AI, but the reality is that they delocalized in India because to reduce costs. They know that it's more acceptable to say that we lay off people because of AI rather than say we lay off people because we moved production in India. And therefore AI washing is really something nowadays. And therefore what's interesting is that even though we keep expecting AI to take over, the real contraction is yet to be seen, and there's a decline in AI hiring rate based on the expectation that AI will be substituting workers. This is especially for sectors in the creative, creative or administrative jobs. But it's still, I would say, even though I would need to look at the data more carefully, but it's still much less than it's still beginning to happen. It's not really tangible yet. But what is tangible instead is labor shortage, at least that is to me. And so there's a very interesting contradiction, because AI doesn't reduce work, it intensifies it, at least for now. And at the same time, AI is eliminating jobs. This is Forbes magazine, maybe last week. So why is a labor shortage looming? How do we make sense of these two things together? And I think if we pay attention to the sectors in which this is happening, possibly they can coexist. And again, it will make our society and the labor structure, the productive structure of our society even more dysfunctional, possibly. And taking the conclusions from Helen Esther's book, I don't remember whether it's After Work or Post Work, but one of her most recent books, where she suggested that we should reduce, redistribute, revalue labor, potentially also refinalize work. What is it that people need? Why work doesn't respond to people's needs anymore. We have so many needs that are unfulfilled in terms of education, healthcare, and we would need, like they did in Spain, to actually invest in those sectors, because it would benefit both workers and the middle class and society. So refinalize, rethink work, reduce, redistribute, and revalue, and obviously reorganize or organize. So thank you.